ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. These are the words of Samuel Beckett, the Nobel Prize-winning Irish playwright. Personally, I always found them to be a wonderful tribute to humanity's endurance and tenacity. Just a few days ago, I heard these words again in the latest film by Roman director Francesca Comencini. The Italian title is Il tempo che ci vuole, which translates as The Time It Takes. The film itself is a tribute to the relationship between a daughter and her father. The father is Luigi Comencini, the master of Italian filmmaking. And the daughter is herself, Francesca, with all her stumbles and failures. One of which is caused by an invisible obstacle, as evasive as powder. The same obstacle that brought an entire generation to its knees. The Time It Takes is also this. The story of how the streets of Italy were suddenly flooded with heroin, a substance which made no discriminations. The protagonist of the film falls prey to the drug as well, just like her friends do, a crowd of sullen faces in dark orbits. Francesca grows attached to one of these young addicts. He has the elegance and flair of a romantic hero. Those who know the history of Italy in the 80s know that this boy is the journalist Carlo Rivolta. Rivolta was one of the most important writers for the Italian newspaper La Repubblica since its inception in January 1976. His articles would detail the shift from before to after, meaning the end of the 70s and the start of the 80s. He would write about political movements, counterculture, and armed revolt. He would document the birth of the 80s, the victory of the conservative counter-revolution, and that of the free market. Rivolta would also write about heroin, and heroin would ultimately kill him. After all, drugs are the perfect symbol for systems of production and social relations. They're the one perfect good that can never be overproduced. They're the one market that never creates a bubble. In short, they're secretly a capitalist's dream. I'm Guido Brera, and you're listening to Black Box, The Hidden Side of Finance, a podcast from Cora Media. All drugs reflect their times. When we talk about drugs, we talk about everything else as well. About economics and urban spaces, about repressive policies and laws. We talk about poverty and the lack of prospects. About inefficiency, about markets, about capital and the laws of offer and demand. Drugs and history go hand in hand. They open and close each phase, and they announce changes on the horizon. For example, heroin in Italy was a drug of transition. It effectively killed the 70s, after which it became the soundtrack in the background of the 1980s. The first Italian death caused by heroin, the patient zero according to manuals, took place in Udine in 1974. 2 years later, the toll was 31 deaths. Not a lot, but enough for the media to talk about the drug epidemic in drastic tones without attempting to understand it. The Sociology Institute of Milan studies the words used by news outlets when talking about heroin. Addicts are always depicted as deviants, filthy, subhuman, violent, and foolish. These are the exact terms used by Italian newspapers, such as Corsera, Il Giorno, L'Unità, Avvenire, La Stampa, and La Notte. In short, almost all of them. But not Carlo Rivolta. He's on the other side of the battle, on the side of the doctors, psychologists, and those professional figures that deal with the epidemic on a daily basis. These are the people who don't judge. Instead, they prefer to publish manuals which document the issue and teach others how to manage it. But Italy in 76 is still obsessed with politics, and drugs aren't on most people's minds. Rivolta is 27 years old then. He's young but already a rising star in journalism. He cut his teeth writing for the historical Roman periodical Paese Sera, and now he's part of the team on the newly christened Repubblica, founded by Eugenio Scalfari. In January 1976, it's still mainly politics, but Carlo has an eye for the drugs that have taken over the streets of Rome. The city is changing, and there's something rotten at its core. The drug centers such as the one in Via Merulana are already buckling under the pressure. 2 years go by. It's 1978, and the situation is past boiling point. In Carlo's words, the amount of addicts in Rome has reached a number of units which is more or less over 10,000. And then he asks himself, have we lost the war against drugs? But the situation is about to get worse. Rome streets become an open-air market. Campo dei Fiori, Piazza Buenos Aires, Piazza Bologna, Monteverde. Heroin is sold everywhere. Heroin causes aphasia, in the sense that it rips the words away from its users. It breaks down relationships and forces addicts to a life of solitude. It's the drug that destroys political movements. But how did it reach Italy? Some say it was the intelligence agencies, such as the CIA. There's talk of Operation Blue Moon, and who's dealing it? Most point their finger at the old crime families. But a few believe that a new gang is banking on it and taking over Rome with the profits. This is what the Rivolta believes as well, and that new gang exists. It's growing in the Magliana district of Rome. What everyone knows for sure is that the dead are piling up. In 1978, the Red Brigades kidnap and kill Aldo Moro, the president of the Christian Democratic political party. Political clashes are getting more violent. An entire generation is forced to choose between jail or guns, and many others, too many, seek refuge in heroin. In January 1979, La Repubblica releases a long report on the quality of heroin in Rome. Samples are analyzed and the results paint a map of the type of drugs sold in each city square. By now, everyone is aware of the dangers of overdosing and of the care that users need to take when shooting up. In this extended report, 2 journalists follow a young nameless addict as they search for some white powder in each neighborhood. Those 2 journalists' names? Carlo Rivolta and Gianni Ramini. But Carlo will end up keeping a bit of that heroin for himself. And this will ultimately spell his end. Meanwhile, he's met a girl called Francesca. She'll see him through his last years of life as he tumbles between love, affection, travel, shared hopes, and despair. When Francesca first meets Carlo, she's just 18 years old. Today, she's the director of the film, The Time It Takes. The time, of course. The time that Carlo never had. Him, like so many others. The 80s are in full swing at this point. Ronald Reagan is in the White House. Margaret Thatcher is in Downing Street. In 1985, after a year of protest, the English miners lose their battle against the conservative government's cuts. Capitalism is suddenly turbocharged. The financial districts are all lit up. People seek refuge in the private sector. But Carlo Rivolta will never see any of this. He'll pass away in February of 1982. A century is over, a millennium begins. Goodbye 90s. Times are changing and new substances take the stage. We've already talked about fentanyl before in this podcast, an artificial analgesic which is 100 times more powerful than morphine. In the USA, fentanyl is the protagonist of the third wave of the current drug epidemic, after painkillers and the return of heroin. Taken together, these drugs have killed over 400,000 Americans from the beginning of the 21st century. Around the beginning of the millennium, painkillers sweep the rural areas of West Virginia and the Appalachian Mountains. The Rust Belt of America becomes a cradle for new addictions. Those same drugs that alleviated the pain of severe pathologies now temper the suffering of the spirit. It's the nothing around the void. In 2011, pills are causing almost 16,000 deaths a year, more than 3 times the toll of a decade earlier. As soon as the opioids are dealt with, heroin makes its comeback, perfectly in line with the nostalgia for the past that seems to be so popular in this century. And then, about 10 years ago, fentanyl makes its entrance. First on the East Coast and in the Midwest, where overdoses start to peak everywhere. The reasons are easy to explain. It mixes well with both the white heroin of the eastern states and the black tar heroin of the western ones. During the Trump administration, fentanyl finally makes its way from east to west, and concurrently with the COVID pandemic, it causes more than 100,000 deaths each year. It seems that between 2023 and 2024, the USA has finally registered its first drop in overdose deaths of the last few decades. But caution is still in order, especially because now it's the West Coast, where fentanyl arrived later, that's seeing a steep rise in deaths. The so-called junkies of yesterday would haunt the urban jungles. The drug victims of today, however, are those of deep America, the rejects of deindustrialization. These substances destroy the lives of the lonely, of the dispossessed, of the mentally unstable, and almost always of the destitute. It's no coincidence that the exponential rise in overdose deaths has gone hand in hand with the rise of wealth inequality. We also talked about this in the last episode of Black Box. Every drug has its time, and every time has its drug. Back in the 80s, heroin helped to eliminate political activism, paving the way for conservative privatization and the absolute void of the following decades. Nowadays, fentanyl symbolizes the impossible attempt to fill that void with something, even only a cheap palliative. Yesterday, the international heroin market was at the forefront of globalization. Today, fentanyl represents the crisis of that same globalization. Heroin predicts the future, while the artificial opioid certifies it. And what now? Now we need more time. Just like in the film by Francesca Comencini, which I saw a few days ago. Time to fail again, time to fail better, and time to heal. The time that it takes isn't just a poetic film, it's also a political one. Just like everything is political when it comes to changing an unavoidable future, a final verdict, a death sentence. So we need all the time that it takes to change course. The same time that a father needs to save his own daughter. But in the heart of the West, as we lean into an abyss of wars and ruin, the feeling is that of not enough time at all. Black Box is a Cora News podcast, produced by Cora Media and sponsored by Docebo. Written by Guido Brera with I Diavoli. Editorial supervision by Francesca Milano. Intro and sound design by Luca Micheli. Editing and post-production by Luca Micheli and Emanuele Moscatelli. Production organization by Alex Peverengo.